Right, so we're going to look at the Darien Peninsula, the Darien Isthmus, however you'd like to refer to it. And this site itself, I've already looked at 6 times this week. I have not been happy with anything that I've been telling people because there's just been too much of it. So I think what I will do is I will look at the notes that Professor Mark Horton sent me on Monday, and before we do that, I will look at the other information I've been using for the rest of the week, and I will spend 5 minutes just giving you an overview of that information, which should be rather information, rather interesting, and it would add to our introduction. So I was first introduced by way of the Darien project, thanks to Mark Horton. And in 2004, 2005, 2004, Mark Horton, Bristol University, is excavating at Darien, a site that I didn't know at the time he had excavated in 1979. And most of what we do know about Darien and this disaster of Darien, the Darien disaster, you could call it, the Darien failure. Darien, the expedition of the Scots to found an empire, led to, in 1707, the unification of Scotland with England, or the unifying of Scotland with England, with one parliament and one monarchy. Now, to sort of give you some nuts and bolts, there are lots of reasons why the Darien project failed. But one of the things is very clear: when you present a lecture like this, you listen to people more, and it's not just me telling you stuff. When you've delivered it 6 times, like I've done this week, you listen to what everybody's feeding back to you. And one of the things that's coming over loud and clear is that the site of the Scottish Darien colony, first of all, was chosen because the project was set up to fail. And that is quite a distinctive thing to say, that the Darien expedition, the case involving Scotland creating an empire, was set up to fail. That's a very bold statement for me to make, but that's by listening to people. The whole project was set up under the direction of a William Patterson, who had actually founded, not so many years before the founding of the Scottish Company, in the year 1695. He had been the director of the Bank of England. In fact, one of the first people to establish the Bank of England. And I do believe somewhere along the line I've seen a banknote with William Patterson on it. So Patterson was a banker. He went to the Scottish Parliament and he basically said, why don't we create an empire? So a few little bits of overview. I'm going to run through these quite quickly. And then we'll go on to the stuff that Professor Horton sent me. Now, as I've already said, I've been in contact with Professor Mark Horton since 2004. And one of the things I will say is that I did a video on Darien in 2014, 10 years later. And this video that I undertook to make on Darien in 2014 has actually been used as a learning aid for the University of Highlands and Islands. While I was at the Highlands and Islands in 2017, one of the lecturers phoned me up and said, can we use your video as a teaching aid in connection with the Darien project? And I just thought, oh my God, that's absolutely brilliant. But there's very little out there on the Darien expedition, the Darien colony. We'll call it Darien, which either makes sense and there's very few images out there. Also, it's likely that the Company of Scotland, that was established in the year 1695, obtained between 20 and 50% of all the money circulating in Scotland. In that single year, in 1695, up to 50% of the money circulating in Scotland. And with failure, you can understand, with failure, that would mean there would be great financial problems in Scotland, and the end result was the Act of Union in 1707. A few key facts as well before I get on to everything that I want to get on to. The Scottish Company, the Company of Scotland, was going to be in direct competition with the East India Company. Anyone who knows their history is the East India Company was the company that found trading posts, conquered areas, and eventually that would lead to falling into the crown of Britain, and that would eventually create the British Empire, all thanks to the English East India Company. The English East India Company, if none of you are aware, had its own army alongside the English government. So usually there would be one company for the East India Company alongside the English government's companies. It was meant to be a separate entity, but it acted and flew the flag of the Kingdom of Great Britain. So it all ended by about June 1700. The colony lasted from November the 2nd in the year 1698 and ended in 1700. This must be one of the shortest running empires that I've ever come across. It was an empire that lasted 2 years. Scotland had an empire for 2 years, and it was a very disastrous empire. The backdrop of all this is William III, William of Orange. And he had come over from the continent. The year is 1689. William of Orange came over and displaced King James Stuart. And King James Stuart had been a Catholic king. He'd been of Scottish origins, and then this person from the continent displaces him as king, and now we have a Protestant ruler. And that gives you a little bit more of a backdrop to what's going on. Altogether, in the first stages of raising the money for the Company of Scotland, for its sort of trading company, altogether £400,000 in sterling was raised. £400,000. To give you an idea how much that's worth, people would put their life savings into this scheme, their life savings of 100 quid. Now, if that's £100 of 400,000 and it's their life savings, my granddad in his life savings had about altogether close on £50,000, right? So if you're and my granddad was of working class, so people who put into the scheme were of middle class and upper class. So £100 back then must have been a hell of a lot of money. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds by single individuals were invested into the scheme, giving you an idea that £400,000, £400,000 in today's money must have been billions of pounds of the money in circulation around Scotland went into this scheme. Again, some more information quickly. Not only do we have this guy by the name of Patterson involved in the project, we have a chap by the name of Thomas Drummond. Thomas Drummond was appointed to the first council and with the expedition on July 1698. Thomas Drummond, involved in the expedition, led a fleet of 5 ships, the St. Andrew, Caledonia, Unicorn, Dolphin, and Endeavour. These headed from the port of Leith, and I know I'm going a little bit fast because I just want to get this this into the introduction. And on those 5 ships that sailed on July 1698 to arrive at Darien on the 2nd of November 1698, there were in the region of 1,200 passengers on board and around 200 odd crew. And you can imagine that most of these individuals were kept below deck. It would have been very traumatic, and even before they get there, 80 people are dead due to typhus and terrible things, and malnutrition and all these other things that have beset them below deck. So, you know, even before they get there, this is not a good situation. even though the journey between July to November was actually quite a calm journey, these people lost their lives, and it was a terrible situation to be in. They named it Caledonia, probably after one of the vessels that sailed in this fleet. And Caledonia, the old name of Scotland. Here we go. We do here settle, and in the name of God establish ourselves, and in honour and for the memory of that most and renowned name of our mother country, we do and will from henceforth call this country by the name of Caledonia, and ourselves, successors and associates, by the name of the Caledonians. And interesting enough, where they established their fort, there was no fresh water. And in doing so as well, establishing New Edinburgh, there would be no fresh water supplies into New Edinburgh a couple of months after they settled, because they got there just after the great downpours that this peninsula would suffer for 4 months. And they got there and they thought, oh, this is wonderful. We got fresh springs jutting up from the landscape. This is absolutely brilliant. There's one key point, is not a single Scotsman had set foot on Darien before the expedition. Nobody knew what this place was like. Nobody had any idea. But they banked with this banker, and they trusted this banker. Small print is that between the year 1695 and the expedition heading off in 1698, a large amount of the money that was raised by the people of Scotland had disappeared. It had been embezzled, interestingly enough, by a banker. Does this ring any familiarities, Bill?
It does, doesn't it? History repeating itself.
Yes, in fact, repeating history. So. Yeah. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to go on to the wonderful notes that I've got from our Professor Horton, and I've probably done enough to sort of set the scene. Just a couple of other things to set the scene. After the expedition, the first expedition failed, and they abandoned the settlement. There was a resupply mission that got there in 1699. And they found out that the settlement had been deserted even after a few months. And then another expedition headed from Scotland in 1699, in later 1699, with 4 vessels, not knowing that the whole expedition had been a failure. And they got there expecting buildings to be constructed on the 30th of November, 1699. And again, it was almost as if it was chucking money down a bottomless pit. And don't forget, Jessica, just remind me that there's something I would like to tell everybody at the end.
Yeah, that's fine.
About why this was such a stupid idea. So here we go. So we're looking at the images. Let's go to my notes from Mark, and we've had the plan in front of us for a few moments through this lecture today, and that's not a problem, for 15 minutes. And what we're looking at there, if we sort of go all the way up to my little cursor bar, let's get my annotation up there, and bingo. That was going to be New Edinburgh. We've got archaeological evidence, not the history. On Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, I didn't use this document. And I should have used the archaeology more in the earlier lectures this week, and it's led me to understand the whole expedition a lot more by looking at the archaeology. In Mark Horton's opening chapter of Bringing the Early Modern Atlantic World, let's start it again. Bridgend the Early Modern Atlantic World. In his chapter 6, in his opening part of his chapter, it heads to transmit to posterity the virtue, luster, and glory of their ancestors. Scottish pioneers in Darien, Panama. They believed that this was going to be the beginning. This was going to be the beginning of a new Scotland. This was going to be the be-all and end-all. This was what was going to make Scotland. And within under a decade, this broke the back of Scotland. Somebody said to me on Monday, they said, they said, you're not being fair on something, Karl. And I said, what's that? And they said, do you realize you've given the impression that the Scots involved in this expedition at a complete level of ignorance, at a complete level of lack of understanding. This is not the Scottish that we know. You know, the Scots that we know are very wise individuals. They're prime minister. The Scots that we know are great scientists. The Scots that we know are great engineers, great innovators. The Scots that we know have been great in warfare, all these other things, right? The Scots are a great nation, and all you've done in this lecture today is undermine everything that we've ever believed that the Scots hold dear. And I've said, hang on a minute, right? You may have misunderstood the patter. The patter is that they trusted a banker. They trusted somebody that had founded the Bank of England. They trusted somebody that was trusted by the English. They trusted one of their own. And sometimes in trust, disaster unfolds. For example, okay then, let's just put it on the table. Adolf Hitler. Tens of millions of people trusted Adolf Hitler. And look what happened. Were they idiots? The answer's no. The Germans were great innovators in the Second World War. The great scientists, the great everything, the great road builders, the great tank builders, great aircraft builders, great in technology. But it led them to disaster, right? And this is exactly the same thing I'm saying about the Scots. I admire the Scots. I love the Scots. I've been to Scotland a number of times with Bill. He knows the amount of passion I have. But it's a shame that this is the equation of lions led by donkeys or by a donkey that led Scotland to absolute disaster. The idea of virtue and lustre thus wrote back to Scotland, the council, the newly founded Parliament of Darien, of the colony. They wrote back on the 29th of December, conveying the hopes and ambitions of an entire nation. This isn't a few people who have invested their money. It's thousands of people. Where many believe this attempt to create an overseas colony would restore the economic fortunes of the country, make them greater than England, make them as great as the English. But this was at the time that they had a joint monarchy. This was at a time that they shared the aspirations of the English, but they were not of the English. The English dominated the waves. It was English this, English that. This is where we get nationalism and politics from. In 2014, the reason why I did that video in 2014 is I believed sincerely that that Darien was a message from the past. I believed in my heart that it was probably not the best time for the Scots to go independent in 2014, because the Scots were entering into an independence referendum without telling us what they were going to do. It was a Darien. The Darien was a microcosm of the referendum vote in 2014. But now today, 6 years later, I believe Scotland is ready for independence. This is not a nationalistic lecture. This is a lecture about archaeology. But the point I'm trying to make is that by learning from the past, I think the Scots have learned from Darien. I think they now understand Darien. Darien's become important to the Scots. And now they can say, if we have independence, this is what we're going to do. And that's what they didn't do 6 years ago. And Darien, if they had done something slightly different with Darien, the whole history of Scotland would have been different. As things turned out in a very short time, this colony, set up by the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies on the Darien Isthmus of Panama, became one of the more tragic episodes in Atlantic history, with the death of around 1,500 of the 2,800 colonists that got there. Basically, if you want to equate this is the amount of people who went down on the Titanic. You know, this is like all the hopes of the Titanic, right? The greatest ship to ever sail on the sea, and then it goes down, right? Darien is a metaphor for that. The abandonment, the capture, the abandonment of the settlement, the capture and loss of its shipwrecks, the indignity, the loss of, in today's money, billions of Scottish capital. This is known. to be a turning point in Scottish history. Do you know what? I've always loved Scotland. But one thing that I always feel about the Scottish is that they've had so many chances in history and they've blown them. You know, look, for example, after the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the Scots, even though they had defeated and this wonderful victory of the English, now they were in an independent country. You've seen the films, okay? You've seen Mel Gibson and all these wonderful things. But after that, things started to go wrong. There was infighting. They had got what they wanted and they didn't do anything with it. They didn't have those great navies like the English. They didn't do the things like the English, and and then you have all these wars and different things where the Scots seemingly are the ones that seemingly lose and they go into decline. And with all the greatness that Scotland has and everything it has at its fingers, it always seems to be undermined by something. It always seems to be led by an idiot. And this is what happened. The origins of the Darien scheme. Looking at William Paterson, he was of lowland Scottish birth in 1658. But like many, he went abroad. He went to England. He went with his family to the Caribbean. He was there in 1673. In 1681, he was at Port Royal, Jamaica, surrounded by pirates. And listen to this. He may have heard from a pirate. Here we go. Bit of play acting. "Who are, Jim lad? William Paterson, I know over there. A place called Darien. There's gold and riches. Who are?" And William Paterson kept that in his mind. And like all pirates, they lie. And he kept that with him. He established the Bank of England. You know, he was one of the founders of the Bank of England. He was there. You know, he was trusted. You know, as a Scottish lowlander made good. You know, he was one of the most important people in the country. But he kept this information in his head by a pirate. Again, in my notes, it's a privateer, told him this. And he kept her in his head and he thought, why don't I go to the English and say, he presented it to the English. He said, why don't we establish a colony at Darien? The English said no. You note that he went to the English first and not the Scots. But that's a clue. That's a clue to this man's mindset. And then he goes to the Scottish Parliament. In 1698, the Act of the Scottish Parliament, the Company of Scotland Trading in Africa and the Indies was established. This was going to be a fresh start, and he told people what this pirate had told him. He said it was full of wealth. You know, it was a Garden of Eden. And I'm not rightly sure whether he told them there was lots of gold there, but he certainly spun it. He sort of said, look, you know, look at all this. It's so wealthy. But he'd never been there. I believe not a single Scotsman had been to Darien. Nobody knew the faults of Darien. Nobody knew, Bill and Jessica, why the Spanish hadn't settled there. We know today why the Spanish hadn't settled there. The Darien Peninsula is one of the only places on the planet that people are warned not to go. You are forsaken from going to Darien because of the terrible nature of Darien, because of everything that Darien isn't. People don't live on the Darien Peninsula in their thousands, and that gives me a clue. You know, it's full of bandits in those forests. It's full of terrible terrain. It's full of all the wolf diseases, all those dangerous animals. People don't use that landscape today. There is an indigenous population, but like most indigenous populations, they know what the landscape is about. And there is our Paterson. There he is. The Darien scheme, after he sort of spun it, he kept spinning it. He kept spinning the thing. Darien scheme had attracted significant support. Lots of people have studied the Darien scheme, but they've been looking at the primary documents. And there's been no archaeological work there until 1979. The archaeological perspectives and the archaeological perspective on this is rather interesting. We know that we've got this Patterson chap, and we know that he's got links with Bristol. Mark Horton excavated there in 1979, went on to being a professor at Bristol. Interestingly enough, the little bit of information which I've reminded Jessica to tell you at the end is related to Bristol and slavery and the Scots' hand in slavery as well, which would be a very interesting perspective to look at. In other words, when the scheme had failed, Patterson and Drummond came up with an idea of going to Africa, ending up collecting a load of slaves. That's another story. An archaeological engagement and perspective is to try to understand whether those eyewitness accounts, those first-hand accounts, are actually true or not. And it's on the ground to work out what the failure was. Did they have fresh water all the time? Did the food go off? Were the goods that they were meant to have traded with the native peoples actually used in trade? So the failure of the colony were written to support various different viewpoints, personal letters, diary entries, and even afterwards it was dumbed down. It wasn't seen to be as great a disaster as it actually was. To be honest with you, it was such a disaster. Again, 1707 reminded. So to understand the written narrative, you've got to look at the archaeological narrative that provides a useful alternative view of the colony and its failings. Another contribution of archaeology makes it, it provides an understanding of the geography of the landscape, the documentary record. Most of the standard narratives, the analysis of the colony and the causes of its failure have been written down by historians and others who had never been to the site. So in other words, people are writing about the site, like I did a video on it in 2014. I had never been there. I'd just done observations from everybody else. But the fact of the matter is, Mark Horton had been there. And this was a clear perspective to understand the living conditions, where they actually were, to give a sense of contextualization of the material and a fuller understanding of why the colony failed. And to be honest with you, they could have thought, oh, we'll just go for a piss up in a local pub and just go back and say it failed. We could all just go to Port Royal. You know, the fact of the matter is we need evidence. We need the archaeology to actually say that the history is giving us the right direction. So the archaeological approach was in 1979, a little bit of archaeological excavation, a bit of surveying work, getting an idea of the whole landscape. In addition to the site location, we've been able to study in detail the main Scottish defences and settlement of Fort St Andrew. At the top here, buildings were constructed as part of New Edinburgh. But the archaeological evidence, even though people wrote from New Edinburgh, folks, they didn't live there. The archaeological evidence tells us that nobody actually lived at New Edinburgh. They built the houses, but they didn't live there. So, you know, people were getting letters back saying, oh, it's wonderful out here. Come on, boys, come on over. It's great. It's wonderful. But back at Fort St Andrew. So let's sort of go back to that plan again, and we'll sort of go back over these things. So again, I've mentioned about this crown, this unified crown. The other thing as well is about this is that King William of England and Scotland said that he did not want the Scots going there. He did not want the Scots creating a colony, right? Even though he was the monarch of both countries, he undermined, as King of Britain, the attempts of Scotland flying its own flag. There's lots of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that they didn't want to spew the wrath of the Spanish. They didn't want another war with Spain, because Darien was a colony that took over land that was meant to have been claimed by the Spanish, which was a very, very bad idea. So what we've got, looking at this little plan, and I'm just going to check something else out a minute. Actually, Anne's just made an important point, and we will cover that in a short while. That is a very important point, Anne. So we'll come to that in a moment. So the key point with this is that what we have the Spanish here, the French over here, the English up here, Port Royal, Jamaica, and we've sort of got the Spanish here and here, and the Scots decided to set up a colony smack bang in the middle of all this. And they thought, what they're going to do, they're going to build, they're going to stretch, they're going to have a roadway going from the Caribbean all the way over to the Pacific. That's what they were going to do. And this is what their plan was. And when you think about it, why didn't the Spanish do this? The Spanish had already been there over 150 years. So why didn't the Spanish do that? Why did it need the Scots to do it? And that gives you a clue to why this failed. It's not a matter that the Spanish didn't try it because they weren't intelligent. The Spanish didn't try it because this was not the location on the Darien Peninsula to actually have a land link between the Caribbean and the Pacific itself. So New Edinburgh, quite there on a limb. Lots of books have been written about this, the Darien disaster, a Darien adventure. And just quickly away from my notes a minute, just so that we can look at this as well. When you think about the scheme, there is Scotland, there is Darien, and there's where they could have had a colony in Africa. And if I was a banking man, right, I know where I would go. And do you know why I would go to Africa? Is because most of Africa hadn't been claimed by anybody. It wasn't until 1878 that there was something known as a scramble for Africa. The French went out there. The Germans went out there. The Italians went out there. The English went out there. The Portuguese went out there. The Belgians went out there. The Spanish went out there, right? Everyone goes to Africa in 1878. But this itself is nearly 200 years before. Africa was open for trade. There was gold there. There were slaves there. Okay? Taboo. I can't mention the word slaves, but this is 200. This is over 300 years ago. Things were different then. Attitudes were different. And when you think about it, you look at that and your mind starts to glaze and you think, why Darien? Why a place that no Scottish person has ever set foot in before? It's so far away. Surely there could have been somewhere else. Why they decided this? They only decided this a year before they sailed. So I'd like to remind you as well, tomorrow at 1 o'clock, we're going to be on YouTube. So that's to remind me of that. So again, when the archaeologists, when Mark Horton decided to look, he was looking for material culture. He was actually looking for archaeology, not just buildings, not anything else, the archaeology itself. So what they did, they excavated a bit of the bank of Fort St. Andrew. And this is where New Edinburgh was meant to have been established. Now, when they were excavating, they found scatters of material culture at Fort St. Andrew. They found ceramics, glass, they found beads, metal objects, all of the archaeology undisturbed. It was left where it was left. Barrels of clay pipes, left where it was left, never touched. This is perfect archaeology. But when they started working at New Edinburgh, all they found was post holes, a little bit of archaeological evidence, a bit of material culture. But that's all they were finding. They were finding post holes, indicating that the buildings may have been constructed, but nobody ever lived there. excavations have also been possible of both the fortifications and the internal levels. Remarkably, for a colony of such short duration, we've got lots of archaeological evidence. When we think about it, they were there for about 12 months in total, with lots of people staying on board their ships. There was much to discover and considerable archaeological material, both on the surface and in stratified contexts. The whole level of archaeology helps us see an interaction of why things failed. We know one thing, and we know lots of things, that when the first colony had been abandoned in June 1699, by the time the next group got there, by the 30th of November 1699, only a few months later, most of the buildings that had been established at Fort St. Andrew and most of the buildings at New Edinburgh that had been established were gone. They had either been overtaken by the jungle within a few months, yeah, that's what happens, or they had been burnt down by the Spanish. So what we think from the history and what we know from the archaeology isn't always the same. So the success of the colony depended on three interactions. The natural environment. They were unable to tame the natural environment because they spent so much time defending Fort St. Andrew. They built their buildings at New Edinburgh in the wrong place. They underestimated the Spanish. You know, the Scots believe, now I don't, okay then, right, what I'm going to do, Bill, I'm going to claim part of your garden and expect that you're not going to realize that I've claimed it. And you're going to come out and say, oh, you can have part of your garden. That's what they thought. This is what they thought. They thought the Spanish were going to allow them to have Darien and to set up a trading company that would directly compete with the Spanish. They thought that. How naive and stupid is that? And with the indigenous population, they thought they were going to get help and assistance. Well, with all three, they failed. You know, this failed. All of those three parameters failed. 2.5 expeditions were sent. The expedition in 1878 started again in 1698 and 1699 with a resupply mission getting there by about August 1699. And initially 5 ships, as we've already mentioned. The resupply mission, 2 ships. Another 4 ships went out. Another two ships were involved in the expedition. Altogether, 14 ships involved in the expedition. 11 were lost. So can you imagine the financial aspect that would have on Scotland alone? They've got to compete. They've got to compensate the ship owners of those vessels as well. So, you know, you're talking about the average ship today costs hundreds of millions of pounds to build. You know, those ships in today's money, maybe 10 million pounds or whatever each, and all the costs go into it. All the costs. Just think of some really terrible blunders that they made, right? And you'll be surprised by some of the ineptitude of these blunders. But before we actually go on to that, one thing I wanted to mention was this. On board one of the ships was lots of tools, axes, brilliant, spades, brilliant, flooring nails, brilliant, pistols, well, yeah, it's good for defense, isn't it? And then you get the bizarre things, folks. 85 ceremonial wigs, 2,000 hats, 1,301 pairs of slippers, 324 pairs of women's gloves, 3 horse-drawn carriages, they had no horses, household items, 9 smoothing irons, 94 bed covers, and 10 cups. That's the manifest on board one of the ships. I think that belongs to one family or something like that. And you start to think, what was in these people's minds? They believed that they could trade those ceremonial wigs with the natives. They believed that they could trade hats. And can you imagine going up to one of the native ladies and say, oh, why don't you have a wonderful glittering pair of slippers? And she's going to look at you saying, I've wandered around without shoes on my feet all my life. Why do I need slippers? What about these gloves? Go on, let's trade some gloves for some gold. In other words, we're talking about they were unaware what they were getting into. Do you know, I do love Pat to bits, but whenever I've been away with Pat, she's had a case that's got more stuff in it which could last her a whole year. And I've got, with Kathy, right, we've got a little backpack and that's all we need, right? We take what we need, Pat. So
He doesn't understand that, does he?
Pat, you are one of those which would be on that expedition with all your stuff. But you would be with a Welshman, so he would do sensible things. So what it was decided was that out of those 1,200 individuals on board the vessel, probably 200 sailors, around 1,400 or whatever you're looking at, we don't really know the figures, on board those 5 vessels. A third of them would discharge Highland soldiers. And the Scottish Parliament said, what we'll do, boys, we'll give you 50 acres of land. All of you will get a plot each, a 50-acre plot. That's what they said. Unfortunately, the company of 5 ships were fitted out with trade goods. And these trade goods should be questionable, as we've already mentioned, in the belief that ships would call at this remote colony, which was, of course, well out of the way of any of the Caribbean trade routes, sea routes. And I've given you a little list already. Woolen bonnets, wigs, stockings. Well, me and Bill would have a pair of stockings, but I don't know about anybody else. Hats, barrels of clay pipes, barrels of brandy, bottles of brandy, shoes, and even combs. Bill, you can interject.
Bagpipes.
Probably as well. Probably as well, Bill. But the fact of the matter is, they were not set up. They were not set up. You know, combs. You know, they're thinking that they're going to be able to trade these things, and the logic is, Bill and Jessica, they're going to be able to trade these items in return for food. So they didn't take enough food with them. After leaving in July, Scotland in July, they got to Darien the 2nd of November. They had used up most of their supplies. So when they actually got to this locality, they believed that ships would come in, and the ships would come in and say, you can imagine a conversation, can't you? I don't know. I want some food for the colony, Darien. And the ship's captain is saying, well, what have you got to trade? We have got the finest stockings and hats and clay pipes from Scotland. We want in exchange for barley and some sheep. And you can imagine that the other ship's captain is going, you what? Are you for real? In other words, this idea of trade was doomed to fail. And do you know what, Bill? Do you know when somebody gives you 50 acres of land, what's the next thing you're going to do with those 50 acres of land, Bill, with your family?
Sell it.
Sell it?
At a profit, yeah.
Yeah, but what you need to do, you need to make the land profitable, don't you?
Yeah, make a house.
Yeah, and what you need to do to keep you fed.
A farm.
Yes.
Build property, grow crops.
Exactly. You can't. It's pointless building houses if you can't feed yourself. They went with no seed to sow. On board any of those ships, there's no seed to sow. So after you've done all the furrows in the field, you're going, wow, look at what I've done. And then people are turning around to say, and we've got no seed to sow. So you can imagine this is set up to absolutely fail. And the other, what is also critical, they couldn't sail into Port Royal in Jamaica because they had very little in the way of gold with them. They had no money to buy local supplies, as provisions ran out and their provisions failed. So this is all going extremely disastrous. The major blunders, the very major blunders, was to actually establish this as a trading colony here. This is it, and the reason why we're going to go on to that now. Right, so here we go. Now, anyone that knows anything about anything about tides and winds and so on, in the Caribbean, you get a westerly wind, and they established it in this bay, so it's going to be battered by winds. So it's a narrow and long bay, and it's going to be facing. Here we go, a long and narrow harbour that faced northwest into the prevailing wind direction, with 2 reefs at its entrance. So you could sail in here, but you couldn't sail back out. So for trade, this was absolutely disastrous. And with at first, they sailed the ships in, they thought brilliant. But then they think, we can't get them out. The wind's against us. It's actually against us. The strange thing is, in this reading, I didn't actually know this until sort of this week. If the Scots had actually established their settlement 5 miles north from here, they could have occupied a site that was absolutely perfect. And a site which was absolutely perfect was known as Akla. Akla had been a Spanish town that had been established and abandoned in 1560. It had been abandoned because, it wasn't the best place to be for the Spanish, but it had perfect harbourage. That's where the Spanish settled there, and there were buildings already up there, right? However, the Scots chose this area completely virgin territory. And the harbour was once thought you could have hundreds of ships in here. But slowly but surely, they realized that this was a really bad harbour to set up a fort and have harbourage and the new settlement of New Edinburgh. It was believed at the time that this was a paradise on earth. Well, when they got there in November, it was seemingly a paradise on earth. Water was shooting up from the water, fresh water was shooting up from the ground, water shooting up from the water. Water was shooting up from the ground. There was a bounty of animals, fauna, the flora. There was rich fruit. Everything was great. One of the commodore of the fleet said that streams sprung in bubbling joy from the feet of cedars. But they had no idea. They had no idea of the seasons either. They were completely unprepared for this. It was only the end of the rainy season, and of course the water's bubbling up from the surface. They had no idea that where they were setting up New Edinburgh, that within two months, there you go, a stream there. Within 2 months, the water supply from these springs would dry up, leaving the only reliable water over here. So in other words, if the settlement needed water, they needed to send ships over here to fill up their barrels to go back across here for New Edinburgh. In other words, this is why this is called Watering Bay. So you can imagine that this is not a good situation to be in. Bill keeps saying this to me whenever we go to hill forts in Britain. He says, why is there a hill fort up here? There's no water. And I keep saying, well, that's the answer, Bill. They're not actually for settlements. They're actually to keep cattle in the winter months, and to keep grain in the winter months. And in the summer, the cattle come down from those hill forts, those upland areas, and they graze in the valleys. That's what's happening. That's why there's no water source up there, right? In most examples with the hill forts. And this was the situation here. You can't keep a settlement if you're having to go and get water every day. You know, this takes it back into the Dark Ages. The prevailing wind direction in the November winds are generally light and variable and blow off the land. But by December, the trade winds set in at a steady force of knot 5 from the northwest directly into the harbour. So here we go. There you go. They're going straight into the harbour. Anything that's going straight into the harbour is going to hit that reef. It's going to hit the rocks. Unless you've got a decent captain, you're going to come a cropper. If you sail all the way and the winds are still pushing you, you're going to go straight into the swamp. This is how treacherous this bay is. But no, they decided to set up the settlement here. This is where everything's going to be. Not only did this create a substantial swell, but also made it impossible to leave under sail. So this was absolutely useless. So they're not going to get occasional visitors. They're not going to get anyone sort of pulling in, saying, look, can we have some of your wigs? You know, somebody described it on Monday. You can imagine a Native American using, sewing all the wigs together and using it as a coat of some description. I think it could look quite sexy. The chosen bay also had much poorer connections with the mountains behind. At the end of the bay is a large swamp. So here we go, Bill. Right, what we're going to do? We're going to have New Edinburgh here. Let's draw a road in here. Let's build a road, Bill. Come on, Bill. Let's build a road. So you've got to go all the way down here, avoid the swamp, all the way back up here, and then we're going to go to the coast. It doesn't look good, does it, Bill? And this made it completely the wrong place to try and get access to the Pacific because of everything wrong. What they should have done was to have gone up the coast, or maybe they could have built something on this side. Unfortunately, this was much a rocky precipice, so it would have been rather difficult. The only bay was here, and you couldn't have a village here or a town here because at the back was a swamp. So things are really going against them. Now, a few other things about this whole thing. All right, we've mentioned Fort St. Andrew a few times. So let's move a little bit to my notes again. So the defensibility of the harbour was an illusion as well, as on the western side of the entrance, as we've already mentioned, is this rugged cliff line. Despite the resolution to build a battery here, in the early days of the colony, it was never started. Now, actually, to be honest with you, Bill, if you would have set up a battery here, a defensive battery, nobody could have got into the harbour. But they chose not to do that. And it's said, very interestingly enough, the harbour was to be defended from only one side. So in other words, it was to be defended from here, where 3 batteries were mounted on a promontory that formed Fort St. Andrew. If the Scots had chosen to settle where the Spanish had earlier built Akla, which is further up the coast, they would have had both water supply, a usable and potentially defensible harbour. So, Bill, are you getting the idea that this was set up to fail?
Well,
or is it just in my head?
I've got a few comments, but perhaps I'll leave that to the end, Carl. You'll be asking questions, won't you?
Well, actually, Bill, one thing do you know, it would be good. We're going to be having a break soon. So what I'm going to say, Anne left a message up earlier on. She said, did lots of these people leave Scotland because of the famine in Scotland from the 1690s? And she's right. But Anne, there's something not quite right about that, because lots of the people suffering from the famine would have been from the lower classes. Lots of the people who put money into this scheme were from the middle and upper classes. It may have been an opportunity to get rid of some of the people off their land. I do agree with you, Anne. And you've got the idea of of religious persecution. But I think that would have been last on the minds of the people within this colony. So I think, Bill, what we'll do, I'll do a little bit more talking, and then I want your questions, and then we'll have a break. In early December, the weather changes significantly now, and in April to November, they've got the rainy season again, upwards of rain lasting for 4 to 5 months, at least 4 months, with a steady northerly wind. Indeed, for such an exceptional wet place, this dry season results in water shortages. So in other words, you've got excess at one time and water shortages the next. And also, even the best times, you've got another enemy, Bill. Mosquitoes and sandflies. And they built the fort at probably the worst place. This was 0.5 meter above sea level. Which would mean that it would be quite damp, and you'd have lots of mosquitoes and those damnable sandflies. May they all be burnt at the stake and never to return. So the insect problem can be described as amongst all the problems. And when you think about the reports going back, so the point to be made, I've missed it, and you probably missed it yourselves. When they got there in November to December, that was probably the best time of the year that they could have arrived. And then everything else, mind my French, goes to shit. The end of the rainy season, and then the start of the stormy dry season, and then the wet season. So they probably got there about the right time. So that meant that when news was actually heading out on the 29th of December in 1698 via a friendly ship from Jamaica, the reports from the colony were, in fruitfulness seems to not to give place to any in the commercial world. Lists of the many fruits are given. Nay, there is hardly a spot of ground here but what may be cultivated, for even upon the very tops and sides of the hills and mountains, there is commonly 3 or 4 foot deep of rich earth, without so much as a stone to be found therein. This is perfect. So you can imagine going back, Bill, this is what happens, right? The letters go back to Scotland, and people say, wow, my investment, I'm going to make loads of money on this. And at this time, they're actually saying that they found gold as well. They actually found fool's gold. But they're saying, we found gold, and people back home are saying, oh, wow, this is brilliant. And people started chucking more money at the scheme, Bill. It was like a bottomless pit. It was like those typical gold mines. Come on over here, boys. I found a golden nugget. And then thousands of people there, and they find no gold, right? California gold rush. This is what Darien is. Even if they didn't go there for gold, they were saying that they've now found gold. Here we go. One of the members of the council, one of the MPs of the new colony said, ever yet, the likeliest means that ever yet presented towards enabling our countrymen to revive, recover and transmit to posterity the virtue, lustre and wanton glory of their renowned ancestors, and to lay the foundation of wealth and security and greatness to our mother kingdom for the present and succeeding years. And a ceremony on the 28th of December in the year 1698 proclaimed this as the new colony of Scotland. And I will add, the new Empire of Scotland, in one of the most healthful, rich and fruitful countries upon earth. Do you know, that sounds wonderful. My God, this sounds great. You know, letters going back into journals saying that it was estimated that they could graze pigs. 10,000 pigs a year could be grazed across this landscape. Sugar could be grown. Sugar could be grown, and you could grow crops of every kind. This was a healthful and convenient land. This was a land of turtles that you could that you could butcher, you know, and all that meat. This and there was descriptions, the bigness of the salmon to that of a perch. Innumerable local fauna being described, the monkeys, wild deer, Indian rabbits, wild hogs, parrots, partridges, pheasants, various kinds of turkey. This place affords legions of monstrous plants, enough to confound all the methods of botany ever hitherto thought upon. The indigenous population being very civil. We are now in a posture of defense against all the Spanish forces in America. We will make this the Scottish beginning. Another letter giving a description of the isthmus from a gentleman who lives there at present, which was also written about the time that the letters got out there in December that year. This source provides a glowing list of the products of the land, the game that could be hunted, and the tobacco that could be planted. This was a rich land. Gold mines 2 miles away. My God. Solemnly promised to defend us to the last drop of his blood against all our enemies, was a quote made from a native. So in other words, the natives were now their best friends. However, this reference towards gold was by hearsay. Do you know hearsay and gold, Bill? Is never the thing. The commentary was apparently based on hearsay. Somebody had dug up stones from an area where they made an oven at Fort St. Andrew. It's said that a considerable mixture of gold was found amongst the stones. It turned out, Jessica, to be yellow flecking in the local granite that outcrops at this point. This was iron pyrites, otherwise known as full gold. They had not found gold at all, but nobody sent back to tell them. So what we're going to do, Bill, we're going to look at 1 or 2 images, and then I'm going to see what you've got to say. And somebody's left a little message up there as well, if I can read it before I go on to the chat. Maybe they were Catholics and wanted to go somewhere other than Newfoundland, where Protestants usually went. This was a new start, definitely, Anne. This was definitely something new. So here we go. Moving on a little bit. This is what you were given. This is what you were given when you bought into the Company of Scotland, the trading company of Africa and the Indies. And there's a little plan. We look at this a little bit more clearer. But Bill, what would you like to say before we have our break?
Well, I think you made the point very strongly, Karl, that when all this been planned back in Scotland, they were planning the colonization on a raft of false information.
Yes.
Now, you would have thought that with all the implications of what they were planning, they would have sent out a survey ship comprising of a lot of educated people like engineers, farmers, geologists, everything else, to survey the area totally and bring back a full, detailed and accurate report of what was available there as a colony and how suitable it was. That didn't happen for some reason, which I find puzzling. So if a survey ship did go out there, they brought back false information. So it was a disaster from the start, because obviously they must have not used or sent out the right people, and people were not qualified to actually comment on the suitability of this as a colony. The other thing where I think, the other thing which I can't understand, why did they sail from Leith, which is the port of Edinburgh on the east coast of Scotland, when they could have gone from Port Glasgow, which I think was a thriving port at that time in 1698.
Right. This is a very important question, which if I'd have done the other lecture, so I've gone directly to the archaeology, but I missed that when I did the overview at the beginning. Yeah, you are right. Leith is on the eastern coast of Scotland, so they have to sail all the way up to sort of Orkney, all the way back down again.
That's right.
So the point. Yes, Bill.
It's bad planning from the start, wasn't it? Obviously.
So
But,
Bill, they went from Leith for the simple answer about Leith, that they wanted to avoid English patrol vessels, which were waiting on the western coast of Scotland. So I think if they would have sailed from the opposing side of Leith, they would have gone straight into English patrol vessels. But when you think about it, England's not at war with Scotland, and they've got a unity of the two crowns. The English were suspicious of the Scottish, and there's all those things. It just didn't work. It really didn't work. Go on, Bill. What was the other point?
You did say that King William was against the project in any case. So I agree with what you're saying now. There would have been ships on the western side to block any attempt to sail.
But these are supposed to be working together. It makes no sense.
Yeah, but
okay, so thank you for that, Bill. If you haven't got anything else to say, anything you would like to say, Jessica? Because I need my break.
No.
Okay. And what we're going to do, we're going to stop the sharing, and just quickly keep it brief, folks. I need a break. Pat hasn't got anything to say because she's not there. Would you like to say anything quick, Anne?
I just think it's interesting. I'm going to have a look at it again.
Okay,
because
right.
We've got Gerald Skarmer, or whatever his name is.
Okay. What I'm going to do, we'll come back to any questions after the break now. So I'm going to take a break, and we'll be back after the break.